Here, under the direction of Dr. James Roman, the Chief of Biomedical Program Office, NASA researchers have developed instruments that can, for the first time, give us the information we need to understand physical and non-physical stress and help us to discover the edge of man's endurance. Jim Roman is an unusual man. He holds an engineering degree from Northwestern University. He's a physician and teaches aerospace medicine at UCLA, and he's a graduate of the Aerospace Research Pilot School, the first MD to ever complete this course. His qualifications, then, to study man in flight are both unique and outstanding. Tell me, you deal mostly with military pilots who undergo combat. Just what kind of stresses do pilots really go through during a flight?
The stress of flying any kind of high-performance vehicle is primarily non-physical stress. There are certain physical aspects to the flight. There's certain times at flight where physical demands are made on the pilot, but they really are only a very small percentage of the flight, time-wise. For example, when the aircraft turns, the pilot is subjected to acceleration. He's being pushed into his seat with a very large force, several hundred pounds, 1,000 pounds at times, pulling G's. However, that, as I said, is a very small percentage of the time. Most of the demands of flight are non-physical. They're mental demands, paying attention closely to what you're doing. It doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of difference whether that takes place in combat or not. The parts of flight that are demanding in combat are the same parts of the flight that are demanding outside of combat.
Well, during a typical mission profile, for instance, when would the stressful parts come, the non-physical stressful parts?
Well, let's take one specific type of operations, for example, carrier operations with the Navy. The demanding parts of the flight generally appear to be launch from the carrier, in other words, takeoff, and recovery or landing, which are technically very demanding, much more demanding than their land counterparts. Whether this is in combat or not appears to make very little difference. It's surprising, but the risk of combat doesn't appear to affect the cardiovascular functioning, the functioning of the heart and blood vessels, any more than risk generally appears to be a factor. That sounds like a nonsensical statement to make, but we've seen it again and again and again, and it really is a pretty firm finding.
Well, we've all been brought up on, the old axiomatic, your heart pounding when you're afraid, and during, certainly the most frightening part of a mission is during the actual combat itself.
Yes, and maybe we're not using the word afraid in a really clear-cut manner. Certainly the pilots in combat have fear, and people on certain missions here have fear, but it's pretty well controlled. I don't know whether that has anything to do with it or not. The fact is, though, that risk is not a big factor. We knew that before we went to Vietnam. We made the first trip in 1965, and to show you how little non-physical stress has been looked at, this was the first time that people had ever been instrumented in combat. We found that the heart rates, or the pulses, were much slower during bombing than they were at launch and recovery from the carrier, in spite of the fact that people were shooting at them during the bombing. It was only small arms fire, but they were still shooting at them. That fit in with what we saw here on test flights, but the results were so dramatic that we didn't really believe them. So this last fall of '66, we had an opportunity to send Dr. Lewis over to Vietnam, and his mission was to instrument some very difficult combat situations. The missions I'd instrumented when I was over there were difficult, but they didn't happen to be the most difficult ones around. So he instrumented the toughest missions he found, over 30 of them, and his results are very much the same way. That even though people were in obviously very difficult situations.
Difficult meaning dangerous?
Yes, very dangerous, and even though they themselves said that some of those were really pretty frightening missions, and demonstrably dangerous one where they were losing aircraft, nevertheless, the heart rates during bombing were surprisingly low. And the fact remains that on his tour, just like on mine, launch from the carrier and recovery was technically more demanding than the bombing itself. So it would appear that things that are technically demanding are more likely to raise pulse rates than the risk itself.
So would it be fair to say then that in order to undergo this non-physical stress, you have to be intellectually involved in a situation, be responsible for...
Yes, David, I think that's a good way to put it. You do have to be intellectually involved. You have to be involved, and it appears to be an intellectual type of involvement.
Not just that sloppy definition that we always go through, the emotional reaction of fear, for instance.
That's correct. And being there isn't enough either. We can't get high pulse rate on pilots who are acting as passengers almost no matter what the aircraft's doing.
They must be involved, and they must have responsibility.
That's right.
Well, that cockpit, a 104, isn't exactly the roomiest place in the world to be. How do you get all these readings? Where do you instrument?
Primarily, the way we do it is we keep our instrumentation very small, and we don't bother with the aircraft. We put our instrumentation on the pilot. This little recorder, for example, to record our medical data, was built specifically to fit in the pocket of a flying suit. That's what determined its measurements. It collects 7 channels of information and runs for 2 hours right now. Eventually will run for 4 hours, and I think you'll recognize that it's pretty small for that. The breathing of this records primarily parameters or measurements that have to do with the heart. This little shiny tube here is what we measure respiration with. Then on my knee, there's a device which collects saliva.
Why saliva?
Well, we really would like to collect blood. However, it's not practical to collect blood in flight, and also it's a bother. Saliva can be collected with a little prosthetic device that the pilot doesn't even feel in his mouth, and which is no bother at all, doesn't keep him from talking. And we can, by analyzing the saliva, come very close to determining what the chemical readings of blood would be in certain respects, not all of them. This little device here is built into a pilot's knee pad. It's an example of an unsophisticated development which is aimed strictly at making collection practical and at making life easier in the operational environment. In this knee pad, we have 9 tubes that we can collect 9 samples in any one flight, and there's little valves that the pilot can actuate, and the whole thing fits on his knee and doesn't bother him very much. And the original purpose of the knee pad, which is to have something to write on, is still, the knee pad can still be used for that.
Well, let's see now. Then during an actual combat mission, you can collect data on the heart and the cardiovascular system of the pilot. You can get a pretty good idea of his respiration rate and some analysis. And you can do almost an analogy to a blood test, a continual running test, and record all this.
That's correct. We can do that essentially on a non-interference basis.
Well, why is it necessary to go through all the trouble of doing this in an airplane during a mission? Can't you just set up a simulation in a lab?
No, people don't get as involved in the simulation. The responsibility is not as clear-cut. There's really not much penalty for doing things wrong, and primarily the pilot simply doesn't get that involved. We could, for example, use situations in everyday life where people have responsibility, where they are working hard intellectually, and demonstrably we'd get high heart rates. But these situations in everyday life don't come on a strict schedule the way they do in the flight test business, the way they do in combat. It's really because non-physical stress is available in relatively pure form, on time, on schedule, that the flight environment and that the high-performance aircraft represents an ideal laboratory for this kind of physiological research.
Well, I think before we go any further, I'd better ask you to define a little more rigidly what physical and non-physical stress is.
David, let's do that in the laboratory where we can do it a lot better than we can here.
Okay, fine. I'll get down and you can get out.
This is our stress laboratory, David, and this is a bicycle exerciser, and I think it might be a good way to demonstrate what happens to your pulse rate when you do physical exercise as contrasted to being stressed in a non-physical way. Why don't you sit down?
All right.
You already have the electrodes on you and the recorder in your pocket,
Right.
so all you have to do to stress yourself physically is to start pedaling. And as you do, I'll put a load on the machine, which makes it hard for you to pedal.
All right. How fast do you want me to go?
Oh, any speed. It doesn't really make any difference. And regardless of the speed, you'll be putting out somewhere like a tenth or so of a horsepower, and the machine will compensate for your speed. There's certain similarities in what's happening to you now and what would be happening to you if you were working very hard mentally.
That's what you call non-physical stress.
Non-physical stress, right. That's mental work or work other than physical. What's happening to you now is, as we'll see later, your pulse rate goes up. Your heart beats more times per minute than it would at rest. When you're working mentally, precisely the same thing happens. Also, your blood pressure is going up now. However, if you were working mentally instead of physically, your blood pressure would probably go up faster than it is going up now, and it would probably go up to higher levels.
Even though my physical energy output wasn't as high?
Right, even though you were not doing physical work such as you're doing now. In addition to that, the rhythm of your heart would be more likely to be irregular than it would be now. Now you're doing physical work, and since your heart is healthy, it does not lead to irregularities in rhythm. Your heart's beating quite regularly, and to keep it beating regularly, we might as well reduce the load here. None of us really understand why your heart beats faster. There's very clearly no need for extra muscle oxygen at that time, and we're guessing, we're not sure yet, but we're guessing that your heart really isn't putting out that much more blood. The pressure is going up, but the blood vessels are not wide open. They're probably the same caliber they were before, maybe even constricted, so that there's probably not much more blood flowing through your body and not much more oxygen consumed. We just don't know why.
Can you make a comparison in any way, Dr. Roman? Is non-physical stress more powerful in its effect on the body than physical stress like this?
We could make a comparison. We could say that for the average white-collar worker who does very little physical work in any given day, we can say that the tempo of cardiovascular functioning during an average day is determined primarily by non-physical stress, by how hard he's working mentally, or maybe by something possibly that happens on the freeway going home, or by something that happens at home that's non-physical. In a population of people who work very hard physically, this might not be the case. But so that, from the point of view of the white-collar worker, non-physical stress is primary in determining what the maximum heart rate is in a given day, for example. Also, it would appear that non-physical stress, as we've said before, is more powerful in generating abnormalities of the rhythm of the heart for reasons which we don't really understand. So from that point of view, it'd be very powerful.
Well, if you you're dealing with a highly selective population here. You have young men in the very best physical and mental condition. Suppose that you took these findings that you have and extrapolated them to the average businessman. Would a business executive going up to a board meeting where he had to present a very important plan, for instance, to the board, would he be under as much stress as a test pilot flying a new airplane?
Well, David, I don't think that I'd care to extrapolate, not because I'm careful by nature, but because I've been wrong so many times in guessing. I have a near perfect record in terms of guessing the outcome of our experiments here, a record of being wrong. So I'd rather stick to things which actually have been observed. The kind of situation which you referred to, where a businessman is making a presentation, is one that has been looked at very you might say just the beginning of a look has been taken by some people. And one of those is Dr. Cardillo with NASA down at Huntsville, who has looked at people in daily life. And I think that you would find that in situations such as an important presentation, you'd find that the heart rate does go up quite a bit and goes up probably to the same levels that we see in some demanding flights. Another instance of the importance of non-physical stress in people outside of flyers is one in which we've measured the heart rate in our ground controllers for the X-15, and we find that during certain portions of the X-15 flight, when the ground controller has most of the responsibility, that his heart rate is higher than the pilot's. Then at other times, a pilot has a more difficult job and he has more responsibility, and we find that his heart rate is lower. So that This business of non-physical stress is something which is studied particularly well in the flight environment, but which actually applies across the board, is seen in everyday life as well.
You mean in terms of the physical parameters that you're studying, the pulse, the heart rate, the man on the ground sitting in front of the screens is actually working harder under more stressful conditions than the man who's, what, 100,000 feet up in the airplane?
Yes, at certain times during the flight, that's correct. Most of the stress of flight is non-physical anyway. There's exceptions to that, but certainly the bulk of the stress is non-physical.
Could we see what the physical stress did to me?
Yes, I'll take the recorder out of your pocket and put the tape in the machine, and we'll take a look at what we have.
It's a pretty small recorder to be carrying all that information.
Yes, it was built especially for this project, and it's a very handy device. Without it, we couldn't have done most of the work that has gone on here in the past 2 years.
Is that within normal bounds now, Doctor?
Yes, it is, and we can see that your pulse rate before you were exercising was about 100 beats per minute, which is increased, and compared to what your normal pulse rate would be. Your normal pulse rate would be about 75 beats per minute, and when you were working here prior to exercising, you were working mentally. Your pulse rate went up to 100 beats per minute, which is really quite a normal performance for a job with which you were very familiar. In the early days, when you were inexperienced at your job, your pulse rate undoubtedly would have been considerably higher. When you're on the treadmill, we see that your pulse rate went up for 120 beats per minute, which is not very high, but you're probably in pretty good physical shape, and so for this moderate amount of exercise, which didn't even get you perspiring, 120 beats per minute is a reasonable value. If you were working much harder and working up a sweat, you could easily go to 160, 180 maybe even.
What other types of equipment have you developed, Doctor?
Well, for one thing, we might show the electrodes which you have on you.
Oh, these?
If you don't mind,
No.
These electrodes here are sprayed on, and as you notice, they're not a whole lot of trouble. We don't use tape to stick them on you. There's an electrode here and here and here. We spray them right through your hair, and we didn't shave you. That's very important. We get good tracings with these electrodes, but even more important is the fact that in the dynamic environment, in people who are at work, or in people who are flying, in other words, people who are undergoing non-physical stress, we can instrument them very unobtrusively and not bother them. The wires themselves, you can barely see that go to the electrodes. They're about the size of a hair, and the cable hangs from a little chain around your neck. Now, this is one example of a development which occurred primarily for the space business and which is being used now in children in Kansas City and in Los Angeles, particularly well suited for children because children are always in a dynamic state. At least healthy children, and most sick children are. So they're ideal from that point of view. It's a simple development. The electrode itself consists of powdered silver and airplane glue, but it works, and it's a real addition to our bag of tools to get medical information in the dynamic environment. A more sophisticated way to get an electrocardiogram is this vest here, which gets us a vector cardiogram.
What's a vector cardiogram?
A vector cardiogram basically gives you some of the same information as an electrocardiogram, but it has certain facets which a regular electrocardiogram doesn't have. You can compare the regular electrocardiogram to a photograph or a painted picture, and a vector cardiogram, by comparison, would be, for example, like a sculpture. The vector cardiogram sees the heart in an electrical way. It looks at the heart in 3 dimensions. The electrocardiogram only looks at it at 1 dimension. Now, I used to say we didn't use the vector cardiogram in flight because it didn't work real well on the living. That's an expression I use because if you breathed hard, the tracing was very poor. There were anywhere between 10 and 13 electrodes on a subject, and it was most cumbersome. You couldn't move around at all. This vest here is not really a very sophisticated development. It's something which could have been done years and years ago, just like the spray electrodes. It's just that nobody tried to do it. The vest not only allows us to get a very good vector cardiogram, on people, not only when they're breathing, but when they're moving around, even when they're exercising on the bicycle. One of the main reasons, and also it's dry and can be put on by the patient himself or the subject himself. One of the main reasons we went into this three-dimensional view, incidentally, is because it allows a computer a much better look at electrocardiogram. And we have to help the computer with such things as getting a vector cardiogram instead of an electrocardiogram if we're going to use the computer a lot in diagnosis of medical ills.
Well, you've been working now on these problems for several years. What are the edges of human endurance?
We've learned a lot in that respect in the past 3 years here, and what we've learned is that we know a lot less now than we did 3 years ago. That's really the main message, although I might say that there's other things too that we have learned. We've learned, for example, that we can probably determine non-physical workload with the kind of measurements we make. They're relatively simple measurements, but we think that eventually they will lend themselves to accurately determining non-physical workload. That's one thing I think we've learned. We can't tell at all how a pilot or an astronaut is doing, whether he's doing well or not. That completely escapes us. We have absolutely no handle on fatigue. We can't begin to tell with the measurements we're making whether somebody is tired or getting inefficient. We think we can, however, tell how hard they're working. This is undoubtedly is useful from a mission point of view.
What about clinically?
Clinically, we've learned that non-physical stress is not only extremely potent in terms of determining the tempo of cardiovascular functioning, that it's probably the main factor in determining cardiovascular functioning, but we've learned that the effect of non-physical stress on cardiovascular functioning is exceedingly predictable. It does not deserve the sort of mysticism which surrounds it. People think of the effect of non-physical stress as an emotional effect, and that gives it a bad name, I think justly so. We call it non-physical stress because it can be approached quantitatively very easily. It's very approachable from a scientific point of view, and it surprised us very much. The things that determine the level of pulse rate response due to non-physical stress or the level of blood pressure response are simple things like a man's age, his weight, the type of work he's doing, things of that type. But the main thing we've really learned is the fact that we know very little. If we had listened carefully and read what people have done since the 1930s, we should have known that really by the time the 1950s rolled along. The fact that we know very little, the fact that certain things which we thought were abnormal 3 years ago in terms of rhythm of the heart are probably quite normal because they're seen so often in normal people. We didn't know that. We know, for example, now that a heart rate of 180 beats per minute, which was thought 3-4 years ago to be a danger signal, is not a danger signal at all. The slot man who has a difficult job, for example, in the Air Force acrobatic team, the Thunderbirds precision demonstration team, has a heart rate in excess of 170 beats per minute for over a half hour due to non-physical stress primarily.
And with no ill effect.
With no ill effects. He does very well, and we've instrumented him more than once. This man couldn't stand a heart rate of 180 beats per minute or more than 170 for more than a very few minutes if it were due to physical stress. So that nowadays, we just don't know what the limit is. We're sure there is a limit, but we don't know what it is. And the same thing can be said of the low end of the scale. We used to think that a heart rate of 40 was dangerously low, and we found out that people at the test pilot school go as low as 43 beats per minute for substantial periods of time, so that we've really lost knowledge of the limits since we started work here, both in terms of numbers and in terms of what's normal and abnormal. I think that's probably the biggest thing we've learned.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roman. At the edge of the Mojave Desert, scientists and engineers seek answers for questions that affect our men in space. But the answers they find carry a bonus to our lives, too, measuring the pressures that we face and defining the edge of endurance.